So welcome to our guest artist talk for the evening. We are welcoming Jennifer Meanley, and Jennifer Meanley is an associate professor and graduate director at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. She received her MFA in painting from Indiana University in 2006 and has resided and worked in Greensboro since 2008. Since 2007, she has had work in numerous solo, national, and international exhibitions in Montreal, Cincinnati, Tulsa, and North Carolina. And her work also exists in numerous personal collections. And her work was recently curated in 2014 as a solo exhibition titled Far Away. So I'm going to welcome Jennifer, who's going to tell us a little bit about the work that we have currently in the MSSU Spiva Art Gallery. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks so much for having me. I feel really fortunate to have this exhibition happen during a pandemic, so I really appreciate all your effort in getting the work there and installing it so beautifully. I saw the install shots and they look amazing. So yeah, I think I'll talk for about 40 minutes, hopefully maybe 45 at the most, I guess. If I'm going on too long, don't feel hesitant about interjecting or asking a question. And then certainly there'll be some room for questions and answers at the end of the talk. I wanted to begin with just two paintings that I actually completed at the tail end of my MFA experience at Indiana University. One is in 2006 and one is in 2007. I think this was the last painting that I created there before my thesis exhibition. And you'll notice in my work that there seem to be consistent sort of recurrent themes, both visual and I guess implied narrative themes that I am exploring and I think asking questions of in very different ways throughout the paintings. In these early pieces, this is a 6x6 foot painting, and I was really accustomed to working in a large square format at that point in time. But I think like the body, the corporeal nature of the body as a kind of experience and the ways in which that is often paradoxical to like our cognitive or our intellectual perceptions of ourselves and what is around us. That kind of disembodiment that actually happens because of the literally sort of cross purposes of those types of experience oftentimes is something that I revisit often just as like a theme within the work. And I think it sort of plays out in paintings such as these early ones, really through the landscape as a kind of place in which I'm locating the figures, and the landscape feeling as though it's very much an extension of the bodily forms that are present within them. And also the ways in which the figures seem to sort of be in a moment, contemplative moment, but one that's like very tense, possibly tumultuous, or a moment of turmoil. And they actually seem to be projecting onto the environment around them this sort of, I think, paradoxical crisis that they're experiencing. And oftentimes it happens to be demonstrated like symbolically through like where their attention seems to be framing another subject within the painting. And in these two, that happens to be sort of animals that are central. And I think of like this notion of like temporality, like the timestamp within the painting, like who is acting, who is seeing, and who is being seen. And are those simultaneous events as something that often helps me develop visual structures and to elaborate upon the stories that I'm telling within the paintings. So moving much further forward into the future, this is a painting that's in the exhibition. And this is, I believe, like a 4x5 foot canvas. And for a very long time in my painting career, I've developed like an intimacy with like landscape, and landscape that tends to be very like close in proximity to the viewer. It's usually very, I guess, layered, claustrophobic in nature. There's not a lot of like escape from the forms that create the landscape itself. And so I think that aligning like gestural notions of gesture, notions of like drawing and movement, and literally like kind of passageways through the painting and through sequence of the story that I might be kind of elaborating upon visually, I'm literally kind of threading those spaces together based on the forms themselves. And in 2016, I started a painting, and those paintings these earlier paintings tend to be primarily invented, where I'm not actually using source. I'm seeing it sort of coalesce out of just the material nature of paint and like what happens when colors and marks start to like really like work on one another. This painting in 2016, I returned for a period of time to some observational painting, which I do it infrequently, but when I do it, I tend to like, I guess do it for a block of time where I might return to self-portraiture and to the mirror, or I might hire a model. And for this painting, I had a friend sit for me for just 2 sessions, but it sort of mapped out the placement of the figure within the space. And the interiority of this space was really something that was new and different. I'd never really thought about surfaces as being like the limitations or delineating like a room or sort of a depth of field that was more calculated in nature. And the space that developed around the sitter or the subject was itself invented very kind of laboriously over time, and it changed and it shifted a lot. And there were certain sort of symbolic elements that were things within the context that I don't know, they'd never appeared to me before, but they kind of presented themselves within the language of invention and through the language of invention as important. One is that little kind of seat that happens to be behind the larger figure. It's a bizarre looking piece of furniture. It seems sort of out of time. Like you don't know where that might've been manufactured or made, or, and it doesn't have a precedent. I don't think there's anything like that necessarily in the world. But I think the fact that it's empty and the scale of it maybe suggests like a kind of displacement that's happened within the space that, and this idea of sort of, I think, occupying a place and yet contemplating one's relationship to it feels very much bound up in how I've structured this painting. There seems to be like a small cityscape beneath a table, which elaborates upon that premise. And I think this was the first painting where I really started to, I had read at some point, maybe 2013, a book called The Architectural Uncanny. And in it, there was this term that the author used that was a German term, and it was called unheimlich. And it actually meant, in translation, the unhomely. And I thought that was such a interesting word, given the ways that the author was talking also about the phenomenal and how we, in terms of our formative experiences with space, we often like live in and occupy spaces based on kind of projecting onto them a kind of a filter for how we see and experience them that is not so much about their physical nature, but it's more about like our internal desires for how we're meant to be in those spaces and to live our lives in those spaces. And it's also, I think, connected, the author connects it to this notion of like imagination and sort of conjuring worlds that are not physical, but maybe are about memory or about the future. And therefore they kind of become hybridized in that they might partially resemble things that are native to our immediate experience and familiar in that way, but they're also sort of out of space or time and therefore strange to us. And that very much does relate to this idea of the unhomely and also the uncanny, which I think of as being kind of a theme that my images explore as a psychological dimension or kind of a psychic dimension of experience. So the next few paintings, which are also in the exhibition, are a series of mirror self-portraits, and with sometimes observed synthesized landscapes behind them, where I might be like painting the figure and then going back and kind of finding a space for her to be within. And I think it's really an interesting problem that people run into when they paint self-portraits. For me, it's always been kind of out of convenience that I've wanted to scrutinize someone, and I don't think anyone would withstand the level of scrutiny that I I guess, engage with other than myself. And so it's also about privacy and access. And I think these bodies that I paint about really talk about the idea of like access, availability, to a degree, consent. And so the mirror and my relationship with my own image is like really a realm, I think, of experience. And through the act of like heavily scrutinizing myself in the mirror, what I've really realized is that these are very time intensive, and I'm not super interested in likeness in a, I guess, maybe gratifying, immediate, like pleasing way. I'm much more interested in, I guess, in the act of translating likeness. How is that activity and that method like slowing down my own experience of my own image, my own likeness, and my experience of the world around me? So I'm really interested in this idea of like having a subjective experience through the act of looking, and also being very aware simultaneously of creating a visual translation, and that there is kind of a schism that happens when one is simultaneously like kind of towing that line or straddling that line. And so the paintings enable within me a way of seeing and taking in really minute, nuanced information that then I think kind of conditions me to experience the world in a way that is about extreme detail, or a kind of time-based sensation that is linked up with how we take in information. So we don't take in information. This is a terrible image, sorry. It's better if you see it in person. These are images I had to take myself. So budgets and time. I think that the way that we have these natural buffers or filters that mediate the world and our perceptions of the world, they're there to like enable us to like be able to function in the most efficient way possible, which means we eliminate mass quantities of information that we see or that we register. And I think these paintings are about kind of disabling that filter or that buffer, and to place me in contact with something that's like more uncomfortable, because I'm being kind of immersed in the amount of information that I'm encountering and seeing and trying to, I guess, resolve within the image itself. And therefore it takes on a very kind of psychological, I think, dimension, and one in which you're aware that these people are sort of, I think of them as like overtly vigilant, like they are themselves looking and they're directing their attention oftentimes within the space beyond the view of the viewer or beyond me as the painter. And at that point, they kind of almost have their own autonomy as individuals. And this painting was a painting in which I think this was last year, like 2019, maybe cusp of 1920, maybe. In which I suddenly felt this extreme attachment to the space that she was in. And you can see that the lace curtain is like an element that happens behind her, and the lamp is an element that happens behind her, as well as a window. And these are kind of like recurrent material entities that I navigate within my paintings. And I've noticed through repetition, which is not always calculated, but it's almost like a way for me to solve visual problems, that they themselves have sort of taken on, like, again, like a kind of allegorical significance to me. Certainly the lace curtain as itself kind of being a membrane between the flat plane of the window and the dimensional space outside the window, and the dimensional space of the interior room or the physical space of the figure, I think talks about that idea of like a threshold or liminality. And even to a degree, the idea of like the body and its boundaries, like the physical container of the body not aligning with our experience of the world. Like my experience of the world at any one time far exceeds the capacity of my container, in terms of like what I'm connected to, or what I'm emotionally like moved by, or the way I'm thinking about things beyond the constraints of time, or like literal tactile constructs. And so I think like these symbols sort of also, for me, talk about those same ideas and ways of experiencing things, and key us into something that's like a bit peculiar. Maybe things that aren't simultaneous are suddenly seen together, like time of day versus like light indoors that itself doesn't feel very luminous. So that idea of like luminosity and where the light might be coming from or where it's not coming from, but should be coming from, is like really curious to me as like a visual structure. And this is also in the exhibition. And I've always felt in this painting, and this was directly motivated by the previous painting, which is unlike me to make a small painting from life and then decide, oh, you know, I want to embody within this larger piece things that are really derivative from that prior experience. And so I guess in this piece, the figures usually in my paintings tend to be the entities that are most important and that arrive first. And that's exactly the opposite of how I would teach someone to make a good painting. I would teach like work broad to specific, like don't become obsessed with like description. But I have learned the rules, so therefore I get to break them and I don't really worry too much about it. I always felt that the two people in this painting, though they appear to be very different than one another, and their likenesses, that they were sort of versions of one person, and that they were themselves in, I guess, some sort of like exchange that is obviously tense. It feels almost nearly physical. One person appears to be like literally withholding something or about to use that object in a kind of a vicious way. And one person appears like has this stance of almost like, again, like vigilance or like warding off. And yet they're held in this kind of peaceable like tension formally within the picture plane. And I guess that idea of permutation or versions of oneself or like conflicts and how we like literally resolve dissonance within ourselves, whether that's cognitive dissonance or emotional dissonance, is something that I think my paintings also talk a lot about as part of the stories that they're narrating. And I think that this is one painting in which that's very specific. So color and I think temperature and tint and layering tints to achieve color that feels transparent and luminous, especially like in shadows, is something that helps me like really feel out the dimension of the world, and light as kind of an ambient entity that can attach itself in varying ways depending on where I want to push the viewer or what type of experience that I want them to have within the context of the painting, is something that I really try to more and more skill myself in. And it's interesting because I think like earlier paintings that I made post grad school, and actually the paintings that I'm making most recently, which I'll just show you some studio images of, really, I guess like I've always felt that the fluency of my mark and the viscosity of my paint and like painting wet onto wet and like really this sense of simultaneity and togetherness and feeling like things are really like intermeshed. That was like one of the ideals that I held very closely for myself post-graduate school. And I think over the past 15 years, it's something that I've been willing to ask questions of and interrogate as like maybe always being the right way for me to achieve what I want to achieve in a painting. So this next series, I think, constitutes a very deliberate shift in like application of paint, how I'm thinking about description, the scale of the images themselves, all in an effort to literally like destabilize some of my habits. So this is a painting that's 15 by 15 inches, as are the next few images. And these are also obviously in the exhibition, so hopefully you've gotten to experience them. But these are paper that has been sized with a bookbinding, a watered down bookbinding glue against a panel to achieve a seal. And then, and I have the panel like is very hard. So the way in which I'm painting on it, I feel like is more aligned with drawing than it is with maybe like how I would work or operate when I'm dealing with a large canvas. And I also like the scale of my brushes and the scale of the figures sort of brings me back into this like obsessive language of description, which I sort of have like a love-hate relationship with. I tend to move away from it and then I move strongly back towards it. And I'm realizing that that's okay. Like that's just part of my like the toggling that I'm doing as an artist between kind of two extremes. But in these pieces, again, I sort of was like really compelled by that idea of looking, seeing, and being seen as things that are more complex than maybe just speaking about them would allude to, but voyeurism in a way that I think somehow counteracts the voyeuristic tradition of like male painters looking at and subjugating the female body is actually something that definitely in the past 4 or 5 years, I've very intentionally been sort of thinking about and trying to decide, you know, when does a painting ask questions about who the painter is and their lens on the world and their identity? And when does a painting fall victim to the same sort of, I guess, tropes that like a painting by a Eurocentric man would fall subject to in the contemporary moment. So I don't think I figured that out. And I'm not certainly like suggesting that my paintings are deeply diving into like gender studies or anything like that, but they certainly, based on my own identity, are an extension of that. So I've been interested in this idea too of like voyeurism and the way we might see it in like a painter like Balthus, and how I was taught to really revere Balthus. And actually I love his images, but I can no longer look at them as a woman, like at my age and at this moment in time without like feeling like they're creepy, like there's something wrong here. And I think that there's some formal devices that he uses a lot that seem to just make sense based on who he's painting. But one of them is like a weird scale shift with the people themselves. Like they're painted often small, and even their proportions seem to be like suggesting that smallness is something we're supposed to perceive through the meta form, like like they're almost like comparisons within the figures that happen within the figure as opposed to the figure scaled by something else. And I think that really, like, I remember seeing like Roger van der Weyden paintings or Hans Memling paintings and realizing like this Germanic tradition of painting scale, especially like in the Renaissance and pre-Renaissance or in altarpieces, like is so severe and weird, and it's like very selective. Like an angel, for instance, might have the proportions of like an adult human, but be scaled smaller within the arrangement of the entire picture. And that will somehow indicate something about that person's place within the narrative structure. And so I also keep thinking about this idea of scale in relationship to time or age, and how it seems that like Balthus kind of creating a lens for himself and like subjugating women more or less is like talking about scale in relationship to ideals, like visual ideals, or that we then attribute to like femininity in some ways or to sexuality in some ways. And that's like a whole can of worms like that. I don't think like I want to like I guess be punitive in my like observation of those types of painters or paintings because I love them, but I think it's good to like be really critical about them too. So in this painting, I kept thinking about that idea again of multiplicity, like two versions of one woman, maybe at different ages. And I think this title is really long and elaborate, and it's something like the absurdity of like two women who are like eternally bound to one another. That's not what it is, but it's something like that. Like they're in this room, they are mutually dependent on each other for some reason. They cannot leave the room, and they're not interacting. And so it seems like a real dilemma. Like, how are they reconciling something within themselves that allows them to escape this space? Like, I don't know. I think that's like the big question. Okay, I'm going to move to some collage pieces, which are also in the exhibition. I want to make sure I'm not rambling. Okay, I think I'm doing okay. So collage, these are really, I think, pre-2016. There was a couple of years where I was doing a lot of large paper pieces, and then very recent over the summer as well. For those of you who have seen the exhibition or have not seen it, this is probably, again, like a 4x5-ish frame scale. or size of picture plane. I think that moving towards the cut paper collage was never something I really anticipated for myself. I had a studio visit with a colleague when I first arrived at UNCG, and this would have been like 2009. And she was making these really elaborate, large abstract collages. And she said, they might look really chaotic at first glance, and they were very like abex kind of feeling collages, but she said when you investigate the surface and you really start to understand like how now edge is becoming a kind of real mark within the context of the paper being built up on itself. So you have like depth of field, that's physical depth of field, like it's actually materially like rising up or falling back. And that is sometimes related to like a chronology of when a decision might be made, or it might be paradoxical or counterintuitive to what you think the chronology of the selections and the decisions were that were arriving at image. But she's like, within that material language are the keys for how you're going to look at the piece. That like you can only almost experience them in person because you really have to be investigating them based on material factors. And of course that's true of paintings, but in the digital age, we forget the necessity of that. So I kept thinking about this idea of just like creating palettes for myself that were really just about like kind of in a randomized way, like mixing up a bunch of colors and values and applying that color and value with acrylic paint in washes to pieces of paper. And then I had this like plethora of potential palette color mark choices, and how like the color is kind of a field, and the marks that we attribute to that field are directional. Like you see the residual marks of paintbrushes moving that material, but that doesn't always confirm like the direction of a volume that you're using that material descriptively to make. And that, again, that tension or that kind of like things that are antithetical in that way to each other, but are still working somehow in concert within the whole was like fascinating to me. And I don't know, these felt very formal when I was making them, to be quite honest. In a way that a painting never could. It was too close to me. I felt like I could see more clearly and register my decisions and realize that I was being selective rather than just intuitive, which I think has been really, I used to pride myself on like, I guess, the ways in which going into the studio, never knowing what the heck I was going to do, and thriving on like manic energy to produce paintings in like seems somehow like really epic and right for me. And then like I think actually I had the experience of more or less becoming stopping drinking in 2000 and I guess 17. And I realized when I go into the studio that like I was so sober that like everything felt foreign to me, and I had to like relearn how to paint. And so I guess that idea of like having a method or knowing that I could like carry a theme from one piece to another and actually like ask questions or interrogate that idea differently actually like built up my confidence again. I was like, I'm not crazy. I'm not like chaotic. Like I actually have a method, even if it is mostly intuitive, it's there. And maybe that's just like getting older. I don't know. It seemed very appealing to me. So this is a piece that was recently done over the summer, and again, this is like a really large outscaled piece. So I think it's like in the range of like 12 feet by like, I don't know, 7 or 8 feet. It's big. It's in the gallery with the show. And I started a bunch of gouache paintings last year during the pandemic, mostly because I couldn't go to the building where my studio is. So for months I was kind of like, okay, I got to work really small, maybe on a tabletop. And I started thinking about water-based media and the ways in which luminosity and transparency just creates like this really powerful feeling of light. And it's much less, I guess with a painting, as soon as you've become opaque with your decisions, then you're adding usually white to desaturate, to reclaim areas of light. And that can be, I think, I don't know, it just like underwhelms the sense of where the light is coming from, or it derails it. And I think in these, I wanted to stay true to that like luminosity that water-based media could achieve. And then as I tried to translate the small gouaches into larger pieces, they became different, like different people popped up and showed up as like the figures or the subjects. But I think this piece is a lot about temperature, like literally like physical temperature, like feeling temperature, like being out of doors and maybe feeling spaces of like cold, or feeling spaces of like more moderate, like temperate air. And I guess it's obviously also about an interaction between these two figures. One of them feels very much a part of the ground, like of the earth, and one feels like more physically realized, like in our reality, I guess. And just contemplating, I think, like how they're interacting, it feels both tender and violent and complex. Maybe I don't know, do I have questions that are popping up? I have not been paying attention if they are in the, I know there's not.
I don't see any questions.
Oh, okay, good. Similarly done quickly actually over the summer, and sometimes collage for me is much more time efficient. Like a painting can come together in like 2 weeks, or a piece can come together in 2 weeks, whereas a painting might take months to achieve. And again, the precedent for this was a small gouache painting with a single female figure in the midground and kind of an underscaled house in the deeper space. And I think, I mean, I guess ideas about femininity or how the body is seen, and how we attribute value to certain aesthetic things with the female form, or we are, I guess, self-conscious in certain ways about the ways in which like you can only hold on to your curating your own image for so long, I think, as a woman. And I do think it's a distinct experience to like sort of feel that slip away, that maybe can't be understood by people who identify as male, that these are things that are just kind of embedded within these images. But in some ways, these images were quick and they feel like more like large, flexible sketches to me than they do deeply nuanced narrative spaces. Again, bad image, good painting, or okay painting. This is the last image I'm going to show before I just show a couple of studio shots from recent work. But yeah, this painting is also in the exhibition. And this is a painting that was honestly like kind of hell to make. It went on for, I feel like, over 2 years. And when I finally concluded it, it was only because I had a deadline for an exhibition, and basically they told me they wanted it. And it was bizarre because it was very like left-hand heavy, or like laterally left heavy. Like I was able to sort out all of these forms and place them and figure out like why they needed to be there within the first like 4 months of the painting. That's not fast, but it felt fast at the time. And then like for a good year, it sat against the wall without really any sense of what might happen over here. And there's a lot going on in this painting that is like kind of playfully treading the line of like just pure sentiment and pure preciousness. Like I think this bird, I had a friend, I put this in the painting and he was like, oh gosh, like freedom eagle, what are you doing? And I was just like, I don't know, like when you see it in person, I feel like it sits in the space and it works. But to be honest, like when I see it, I kind of chuckle to myself. Like I think like the way it's painted is sort of alluring, but I think like as a symbol or an image, it's almost comical. Its dramatic entryway into this painting is kind of comical to me. But yeah, I think like this is a painting in which I guess figures that seem to have almost different dispositions, like based on where they might have come from, like what worlds did they come from? How did they arrive here? It never collectively made sense to me. And so it feels like kind of a kitchen sink painting where there's a lot in there. And there's a lot of beauty in it, but it might not all belong in the same image simultaneously. It's a little too crowded. But I think like you can see within this, like my mannerist tendencies with figures, like I'm deeply attached to mannerism and and to that point where you might see something and register it as almost grotesque or a type of distortion, but it's like so elegant that you can't help but be allured by it. And I think a lot of my choices with bodies and how I scale them, or like sometimes they feel like really round and volumetric, but sometimes they feel like really pinched and thin, that those are all just like internal impulses I have directed towards like the strangeness of bodies and yet like how beautiful they are at the same time. So we're gonna just look very quickly through a series of studio shots now of in progress work, just so you can see what I'm up to at the moment. And then I think I'll conclude. And if there's any questions, feel free to ask them. So I'm going to show this image and a couple of cropped details of it, but this is a 6x8 foot painting that's in the studio now, and there's a lot of glare on it. But I think that I see in this painting like a return to, again, a much more open, viscous, like liquid mark, lots of linseed oil, lots of medium heavy painting. And thinking of like energy in my kinetic movement across the canvas and this was like, I don't know, I was so excited to come back from like a period of time off from the studio, and this kind of just like very quickly, the momentum within this painting felt like literally almost like me trying to like catch up with myself, like running full speed, but it was really exciting. And I don't think I've resolved the top, again, lots of glare, sorry. The top third of the painting is not resolved. Like, I think if you just look at the previous image, you'll notice there's just sort of this blue placeholder for sky. But I think like I actually am really interested in what the foliage is doing and where the space is. I also kept thinking about this painting and like thinking of the idea of like really whimsical, like conquering one's foes, or like a conquest that's not violent. It is violent, but it's not, because it's not real. Like the rabbit head or this animal is like so absurdly huge and looks like it could be a mascot that someone just like transplanted off of like, you know, like out of like a sports arena or something. But that kind of like also like the Baroque energy of like the arena or the conquest and the triumph over your conquest or your fears or whatever that is all part of this image, and letting it play out in a way that's like clearly artificial, because in the real world, like we have to sit with our own discomfort so often for prolonged periods of time to even like begin to understand how to be okay with things, that I think like a painting world can be about this like elaborate, like Baroque sense of just like abolishing the things that make you afraid. So here's a little bit better, I think a little clearer with the color here, a little less glare, just getting a sense of like color and light and form and mark is all very open, very energetic, very broken, working together frenetically to create something. This is another one slightly still in progress. I think I'm really interested in actually like going back and tinting the sky to be a violet so that it syncs up with some of the violet decisions that happen back here. And I have this massive mural on my wall, so it becomes like almost a substrate that itself is a world, which I love, like that play between the paintings and this like wall that is its own world. And two images of this, I'm not sure why I included two, but a female figure, again, very Baroque, very very mannerist in how the body has been realized. And I think technically there's a lot of glazing that's happening on the body itself, which is weird because I feel like it carries with it this association of like archaic painting processes that no one really uses anymore. And I was never taught how to glaze, so I'm probably doing it in a way that's like wrong, but I love the transparency and the sense of like volume that's achieved through glazing. And I love kind of the paradox of like the body being so Baroque and like artificial within this landscape of just like a really immediate viscous like paint handling. Like that's an interesting kind of collision of factors for me. And then the last one is just, I think this is the last image, studio shot of just this painting's in its early stages. The context really has no connection to the figure. Again, I would never teach a student to make a painting in this really disconnected, fragmented way, but it seems to work, I think, for me. But yeah, this male figure. And I think painting, you know, like for me to paint the male body, it often makes the painting about something else. Like I think this particular person in this, it's not a real person, it's a fictional person, but he seems like there's the ideas about power in relationship to viewing that I think are very present within like the experience of this painting. And I think that's something that I hope to continue to investigate as he becomes more realized and finished. So yeah, that would conclude, I think, the lecture that I intended to give. I would just like encourage questions if anyone does have them. I don't know if people though can verbalize their questions. Looks like there's something up here.
Yep. Are there any questions? I'm looking at the chat window. So if you have any questions, maybe send them in chat and I can ask Jennifer them directly.
I think my partner, Derek, who's watching from another room, asked a question. He said, do you find an overarching shift in narrative between your paintings of interior and exterior space? And if so, what is that shift for you? I do think that
I didn't hear the question.
Did you guys hear it? Do you want me to read it?
I didn't hear it, but if you heard it.
Yeah, it just says, do you find overarching shifts in narratives between the paintings that are of interior spaces and those of exterior spaces? And if so, what is that shift for me? I think like the shift would literally be a feeling to begin with. I think that's a good question. Like, I think when I'm painting an interior space, I'm literally feeling out the parameters of that space as kind of a limitation or a limiting factor that then I have to figure out, is that limitation actually like real? How pliable is it? So it kind of creates a different mental space for me or a realm to investigate the painting through. And I often find like when I'm building or constructing an interior, I'm really interested at the moments where negative and positive space conflate and fall apart. So like this plane right here at one point is the edge of what appears to be a wall that has a corridor that is, it could be a parallelogram, I guess, but it doesn't make sense according to the rules of like architectural cubic space. And then when you move up that form, it becomes something else entirely. So I think that disposition of like the idea of constraint and then like what can you do within constraint is something that is different with those interior spaces than the exteriors. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
I think there's one other in the Q&A that I'm seeing, or maybe it's just a comment.
I think it's the chair, and I really appreciate that. It says, thank you for arranging and then dealing with the shippers to make this exhibition happen. It's been a joy to have in our gallery and to be able to live with. And thank you all so much. I felt like I was sort of shipping stuff off and putting the burden on someone else. So I understand that that can be really hard, and I'm glad that it could happen. I'm appreciative. Oh, there seems to be another. Claire is asking, why don't you ever have a story that you start with when you begin a piece? That's a good question. I think because for me, stories suggest a plot, and a plot would suggest like a space of time in which there's like a sequence of actions that are happening. And that's just not how my mind works. I'm interested in like many moments of different times collapsing together. And I want that to provoke a space of like the viewer feeling as though they're not certain where they are relative to those events or those things. And I like ambiguity. I like questions more than I like answers. So I think that that's also just like something that's really intimate to how I think. But really good question. Oops. Okay.
Okay.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I thank you all for coming.
Yeah. And thank you, Jennifer. It's a beautiful show, and we've gotten lots of really great comments on it. And I think that everyone's really a bit awestruck when they come into the gallery. So
Well, awesome. Thank
we
you so much.
appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. Well, best of luck to
Okay,
everyone.
well, I think that's it. I don't have any other questions.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine with me. Thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, for the great work on the show. I'm so happy to be there. So thank you.
Okay. Well, have a good evening.
Yeah,
Be
you
safe.
too. You too. Take care.
Stay warm.
Likewise. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.